She accidentally whispered a word in the ancient language to the vampire king's mute daughter at the grand ball. The stained glass shattered. What she didn't realize, she was the first person in 1,000 years who'd spoken the forbidden tongue, and the grieving king watching from his throne would tear apart his own counsel to keep her there. The chandeliers dripped with black diamonds like frozen tears. Mirelle's hands trembled as she balanced the tray of blood wine, weaving between nobles in silk morning gowns and lords adorned with ancestral medallions. 3 months working in the Crimson Keep, and she still wasn't used to the weight of ancient stone, whispering secrets only she could hear. "Fresh goblets for the Duke's table," hissed the head servant, shoving her toward the dais. Mirelle's heart hammered. The dais where King Valerius Nocthar sat. She had seen the vampire king only from a distance, a figure carved from shadows and old rage, with eyes that turned hope to ash in your chest. Tonight he wore ceremonial armor, even at the ball, as if expecting rebellion to break out between the waltz and the blood toast. But it wasn't the king that made her pause. It was the small girl sitting beside him. Princess Lysara couldn't have been older than 8. While nobles laughed and clinked crystal around her, the child sat perfectly rigid, staring at the swirling crowd with eyes too wide. Her pale hands gripped the armrests of her throne like she was holding on against a storm only she could feel. The orchestra's music seemed to make her flinch. The laughter seemed to cut. No one spoke to her. No one even looked at her. Mirelle approached the dais, her footsteps silent on the marble floor. She reached for the Duke's empty goblet, her movements careful and practiced. Don't make eye contact. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't let them see you understand the walls. A nobleman lurched past, wine-drunk and careless, his elbow slamming into her shoulder. Time fractured. The tray lurched. 5 crystal goblets slid toward the edge, tumbling through the air in a cascade of silver and ruby-dark liquid. They crashed onto the steps directly in front of Princess Lysara. Glass exploded across the white marble like shrapnel. Blood wine splattered the princess's gown like wounds. The entire ballroom went silent. 300 conversations died mid-sentence. The orchestra's final note hung in the air like a scream cut short. Even the flames in the chandeliers seemed to freeze, casting shadows that didn't move. Mirelle's knees hit the floor, her formal apology already forming on her lips. "Forgive me, Your Majesty, But her eyes found the princess first. Lysara's small body had gone rigid, her mouth opened in a silent cry. No one else could hear. Her fingers clawed at her ears, her face contorted in agony as the sudden cacophony of gasps and whispers crashed over her like physical blows. The child was breaking apart in front of 500 nobles, and not one of them moved to help. Mirelle's grandmother's voice rose unbidden in her memory. The first words calmed the storm in the blood. Her lips moved before her mind could stop them. "Solareth Nivesh," Mirelle whispered, "a lullaby from the old kingdom, forbidden for 10 centuries, stillness to your spirit." The effect was instantaneous. The princess's eyes snapped to Mirelle's face. The tension in her small shoulders released like cut strings. And then, impossible, unthinkable, Lysara's lips moved, forming sounds that resonated not in the air, but in the bones of everyone present. The stained glass windows, depicting the First Dynasty's conquest, exploded outward in a shower of colored light. 500 vampires froze, hands flying to weapons, to throats, to hearts suddenly remembering what their ancestors had felt when the old magic still ruled. On his throne, King Valerius rose to his full height, his hand on his sword, his eyes locked not on the shattered windows, but on the maid who had just made his daughter speak. The dungeon smelled of old iron and older fear. Mirelle sat on the stone bench, her wrists still tingling from where the guards had gripped them. They hadn't bound her, an oversight that felt more ominous than merciful. No chains meant they didn't expect her to live long enough to need them. The words still burned on her tongue. Solareth Nivesh. She'd heard her grandmother murmur them once, late at night, when she thought Mirelle was sleeping, while running arthritic fingers over a book she'd burned before dawn. Mirelle had been 7, old enough to remember, foolish enough to repeat. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, not the shuffling gait of guards, but the measured strike of boots that had walked over battlefields and broken kingdoms. The cell door opened. King Valerius filled the doorway like a storm front, his armor replaced by a simple black coat that somehow made him more terrifying. Without the trappings of ceremony, he looked like what he truly was, a predator who'd forgotten how to sleep. Mirelle forced herself to stand, to meet those ash-grey eyes, even as her knees threatened to buckle. "Your Majesty, How?" His voice cut through her apology like a blade through silk. He stepped inside, and the temperature dropped. "How do you know the first tongue? Not why did you use it, not what possessed you, just how." "My grandmother," Mirelle whispered. "She was a scribe before the purge. She taught me fragments, lullabies. I didn't think—" "You didn't think?" Valerius moved closer, and Mirelle's back hit the wall. "You spoke a language that's been dead for a millennium. You shattered 5 windows forged by the dynasty's greatest artificers. You made my daughter—" His voice cracked just slightly before he caught it. "You made her respond." The silence that followed felt alive, pulsing with all the words he wasn't saying. "I've had 12 tutors," he continued. "Quieter now, more dangerous. Speech therapists, healers, mages who claimed they could unlock any mind. She's never made a sound. Not once. Not even as an infant." He leaned forward, close enough that Mirelle could see the exhaustion carved into his face. And then a maid whispers to her, and the entire castle feels her power. "She's not mute," Mirelle said, before she could stop herself. "She's in pain." Valerius froze. "The modern dialect," Mirelle rushed on, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. "It's too harsh for her, too sharp. I could see it tonight, the way she flinched at every voice, every laugh. But the ancient language, it resonates differently. It doesn't cut, it sings." Valerius's hand rose to his temple, pressing against it as if he could physically hold the realization in place. The council said she was defective, damaged. He looked at Mirelle with something that might have been hope, if hope hadn't died in him years ago. "Tell me you're not lying to save your life." "I'm not." He studied her for a long moment, weighing her soul against some internal scale. Then he turned toward the door and spoke without looking back. "You'll live in the North Tower. With my daughter, you'll teach her everything your grandmother taught you." He paused in the doorway, his silhouette bleeding into shadow. "Fail me, and the dungeon will seem merciful." The door closed with a finality that sounded like a vow. The North Tower had been built for a princess who never came. The rooms were beautiful in the way abandoned things are. Silk curtains, heavy with dust, toys arranged on shelves like museum pieces, a 4-poster bed large enough to swallow a child whole. Lysara sat in the window seat, knees drawn to her chest, staring out at the moonlit gardens below. She didn't turn when Mirelle entered. didn't acknowledge the sound of the door closing or the rustle of Mirelle's borrowed dress. "Princess," Mirelle began, then stopped. The word felt wrong in her mouth. Too formal, too distant. Lysara's shoulders tensed. Mirelle moved closer, her steps careful on the plush carpet. She could see it now, what she'd missed in the chaos of the ballroom, the way the child's jaw was clenched tight, the rigid set of her spine, the fingers pressed against her temples as if trying to hold her skull together. "It hurts," Mirelle said softly. "Not a question. When people speak. The sounds, they're like knives, aren't they?" Lysara's head turned slightly, not quite looking, but listening. Mirelle lowered herself to the floor beside the window seat, making herself smaller, less threatening. She thought of her grandmother's lessons, the ones whispered over candlelight when the house was asleep. The old language wasn't just words. It was intention, made vibration, emotion carved into sound. "Nivesh," she murmured, "peace," not commanding it, but offering it, like holding out an open hand to a wounded bird. The effect was immediate. Lysara's shoulders dropped half an inch. Her breathing, which had been shallow and controlled, deepened. Mirelle continued, letting the ancient syllables flow like water. "Telmara Sien. You are safe here." Lysara turned fully now, her pale eyes meeting Mirelle's for the first time. They were her father's eyes, but without the ash and anger. Still clear, still capable of wonder. Her small hands lifted, moving through the air in patterns that took Mirelle a moment to recognize. The old signs. Hand speech from before the dynasty, when the first vampires communicated through gesture and resonance before they learned to speak at all. "Hurts," Lysara signed, then touched her throat, her ears, her chest. "Everything hurts. Too loud, too sharp, like breaking." "Because you're not meant for their language," Mirelle breathed, understanding crystallizing. "You're meant for the first tongue. You're a conduit for the old magic, and modern speech is like forcing lightning through a thread meant for silk." Lysara's eyes widened. Her hands moved frantically. "Yes, yes," but no one understood. "I understand." Mirelle placed her hand flat on the floor between them. "Solarith Mavrin. I hear you truly." Lysara's hand moved to mirror hers, not touching but hovering just above. The air between their palms began to hum, a resonance that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with recognition. Magic calling to magic. Ancient blood remembering itself. The princess's lips curved upward, small, fragile, but unmistakable, her first smile in years, given to a maid who spoke her language. The library had been sealed for 3 generations, the doors bound with chains that hummed with warning spells. But Mirelle had spent weeks listening to the castle walls, and the walls remembered when those locks were forged, and more importantly, what words could unmake them. "Verath Senkai," she whispered to the iron, her hand hovering over the central lock. "Release your burden." The chains unraveled like silk ribbons, pooling at their feet with barely a whisper. Lysara's hand found Mirelle's in the darkness, squeezing once. Excitement, fear, trust. The doors groaned open on hinges that hadn't moved in 60 years. The smell hit them first, ancient paper and leather, dust thick as snow, and underneath it all, something else. Magic, dormant but not dead, waiting in the bones of forgotten books. Moonlight filtered through windows clouded with grime, casting everything in silver-blue shadows. Lysara pulled away from Mirelle, drawn forward by something she couldn't name. Her bare feet made no sound on the marble as she drifted between shelves that towered 3 stories high. Her fingers trailing along spines bound in materials that predated paper. Dragon scale, pressed midnight flowers, what might have been crystallized starlight. Mirelle followed, watching the princess move through the space like she was coming home. They found it in the archive's heart, in a chamber where the ceiling opened to the sky. The genealogies of night, not a book, but a tapestry woven from threads that seemed to hold their own luminescence. Every vampire bloodline traced back to the first dynasty, every name written in the old script that pulsed faintly with residual magic. Lysara's hands moved over the tapestry, reading it the way others might read Braille. Her lips parted, and Mirelle heard her actually whisper, the first voluntary sound she'd made. Masara, my people, your bloodline, Mirelle said, pointing to the golden thread that ran through the center, burning brighter than all the others. Look, your name is already there. Princess Lysara Nocthar, heir of the first voice. Lysara's finger traced the glowing thread upward, through her father's name, her grandfather's, back and back and back until the names became pure light. And there, at the tapestry's apex, where the first vampires emerged from shadow into being, she found something that made her gasp. A symbol. The same symbol that marked the ring Mirelle wore on a chain beneath her dress. Her grandmother's ring. The one she'd been told to hide, always hide. The symbol of the royal archivists. Lysara spun to face her, eyes wide with understanding, with joy, with the sudden realization that she wasn't alone. That the maid who spoke her language was bound to her by more than chance. She signed frantically, "You're one of us. You're," and then Lysara laughed. The sound rang through the library like bells, like crystal chimes, like every song that had gone unsung for 8 years pouring out at once. It resonated in the walls, in the ancient books, in the tapestry itself, which flared bright as dawn, pure and clear, and impossibly, devastatingly beautiful. Magic answering magic. A princess remembering how to be a child. Valerius had learned to move without sound centuries ago, when silence meant survival. Now he used that skill to haunt his own castle, checking on a daughter he didn't know how to reach. He paused at the tower door, left deliberately ajar. Mirelle's doing, he suspected, a quiet message that he was welcome if he chose to be. Through the gap, afternoon light spilled like honey across the sitting room floor. Mirelle's voice drifted out, not speaking but singing, syllables that made the air itself seem to thicken and glow. Solareth Maran, Verath Senkai, Limora Veshtaran, the litany of rising. Unless his memory deceived him. He'd heard it once, as a boy, before his father burned every book that contained it. He pushed the door wider, staying in the shadows of the corridor. Lysara sat cross-legged in the center of the room, her eyes closed, her small hands resting palm up on her knees. Around her, suspended in mid-air, floated 24 objects, books, candlesticks, a silver tea tray, even the heavy velvet curtain tiebacks, all hovering at different heights like a constellation of impossible things. Mirelle knelt beside her, hands moving through the air in conducting patterns, her voice never wavering. As she raised her hands, the objects rose. As she lowered them, they descended, smooth as breath. But it wasn't Mirelle's magic. Valerius could see that now. The power emanated from Lysara, a golden shimmer that rippled outward from her small body, responding to Mirelle's words, the way a flame responds to wind. The maid wasn't controlling the objects. She was giving the princess the language to express the power that had always been there, trapped, screaming, with nowhere to go. Limora Veshtaren, Mirelle chanted, and Lysara's lips moved in silent echo. The objects began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, creating a vortex of silver and gold and shadow. The books opened mid-air, their pages fluttering. The candlesticks lit themselves, flames burning without wicks. The tea tray caught the sunlight and reflected it in fractals across the walls. Lysara's eyes opened. They glowed, not the red of blood hunger or the pale grey of her father's line, but pure gold, the color of the first dynasty, the color of magic before it learned to hide. Valerius's hand found the door frame, gripping it hard enough that the wood creaked. His daughter, his broken, silent, damaged daughter, was conducting a symphony of power that most vampires couldn't achieve after centuries of training. She wasn't defective. She wasn't weak. She was what their bloodline had been before they'd forgotten their own tongue, before they'd sealed away their magic to play at politics and power games. She was everything the council feared, everything he'd been told to suppress, everything he'd failed to see. Mirelle's chant softened, gentled, and the objects lowered one by one, settling back into their proper places with barely a whisper. Lysara slumped forward, exhausted but smiling, and Mirelle caught her, held her, murmured praise in the language his daughter could finally hear. Valerius stepped back into the corridor before they could see him. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from rage at every year he'd wasted, and hope for all the years they might still have. Duke Moros entered the throne room without announcement, flanked by 4 council members in their ceremonial black robes. The breach of protocol was intentional, a statement that some matters superseded even royal courtesy. Valerius looked up from the treaty he'd been pretending to read for the past hour, his mind still in the tower, still watching his daughter move objects with light pouring from her eyes. Your Majesty. Moros's voice carried the particular coldness of old nobility who'd forgotten that their titles were gifts, not birthrights. We need to discuss the situation in the North Tower. There is no situation. No. Moros produced a scroll, unfurling it with theatrical precision. Then perhaps you can explain why servants report hearing the first tongue, the language your grandfather banned on pain of death, being spoken daily in your daughter's quarters by a maid, a common maid with no documented lineage. The other council members shifted, a predatory movement. They'd rehearsed this. Mirelle is teaching my daughter, Valerius said flatly, teaching her heresy. Moros stepped closer, lowering his voice to the register reserved for interventions. The ancient language was sealed away for good reason, Valerius. Your grandfather understood that the old magic destabilizes the realm. It gives individuals power that should rest only with the council, with institutions, with you, you mean? Moros's jaw tightened. With order, with civilization. The first dynasty fell because they let magic run unchecked. We've built something better, stronger. And now you're allowing a servant to resurrect the very forces that nearly destroyed our race. She's helping my daughter communicate. Your daughter is damaged. The words fell like stones. We've been patient, Valerius. We've allowed you time to accept it. But now, you're making it worse. This maid is teaching her to wield power she cannot control. The windows she shattered at the ball, that's just the beginning. What happens when the princess has a tantrum and brings down the entire castle? Valerius rose from his throne, and the temperature dropped. Careful, Moros. No, you be careful. The Duke's voice rose, filling the chamber. I have 12 lords ready to call a council vote. 12 families who remember when your grandfather saved us from the chaos of the old ways. They won't allow you to drag us back into darkness for the sake of one broken child. The words hung in the air, like poison. Civil war, Valerius said quietly. You're threatening civil war. I'm preventing one. Moros's expression softened, became almost paternal. Remove the maid. Send her away tonight. Let the princess be raised properly by tutors who won't fill her head with dangerous fantasies. Do this, and the council will support you. Refuse. He gestured to his companions. Well, you've seen what happens when kings forget who holds the real power. Valerius looked at each of them in turn. These men who'd served his father, who'd knelt at his coronation, who now stood before him with ultimatums and barely veiled threats. His daughter's laughter echoed in his memory, bell clear and bright. I need time, he heard himself say, hating the weakness in it. Moros smiled. You have until sunrise. Midnight found Valerius outside his daughter's door for the third time, his hand raised to knock, frozen by the weight of 8 years of failure. He'd killed men without hesitation, negotiated treaties that reshaped kingdoms, survived wars that should have ended him. But this, speaking to his own child, terrified him more than any blade ever had. The door opened before he could decide. Mirelle stood there in her nightgown, unsurprised, as if she'd been expecting him. She stepped aside, without a word, a small nod toward the sitting room where Lysara sat, curled in the window seat, watching the moon. Valerius entered. Mirelle retreated to the bedroom, granting them privacy, but staying close enough to help if needed. Lysara. His daughter's name felt strange in his mouth, formal and distant. She didn't turn. He tried again, forcing himself forward until he stood beside the window seat, awkward in his own uncertainty. I wanted to... What? Apologize for 8 years of absence? Explain that he'd thought she was broken when she was actually extraordinary? That he was terrified of the council, of war, of failing her again? He thought of the tower room, of objects floating in golden light, of power he'd never dreamed she possessed, of Mirelle's voice shaping ancient syllables into bridges his daughter could finally cross. His throat tightened. He tried to remember the phrases he'd spent hours practicing from his grandfather's hidden journals, the ones he'd thought burned but had kept locked away. The words felt clumsy, unpracticed, probably wrong, but he forced them out anyway. Solareth Nivesh? The pronunciation was terrible. He knew it the moment the syllables left his lips. Peace to your spirit? Or had he just said something about disturbing the furniture? Lysara's head turned sharply. Her eyes were wide with shock. Then, impossibly, she smiled. Her small hands lifted, not signing, but reaching for his, guiding them into the proper shapes. Her fingers were cool and gentle as they molded his rough, scarred hands into the positions that would help the sounds form correctly. Solareth Nivesh, she whispered, the first words she'd ever spoken directly to him, her voice like crystal chimes, then again, slower, letting him hear each syllable. Solareth Nivesh, he repeated it, following her lead. Better this time, though still clumsy. Solareth Nivesh. She nodded eagerly, her hands moving to sign, yes. Again. They sat together in the moonlight, father and daughter, stumbling through a language older than their bloodline. She corrected him patiently when he mangled the vowels. He listened with an attention he'd never given treaty negotiations or battle plans. When he finally managed Telmara Cien, you are safe here. Without error, Lysara's hand found his and squeezed. She leaned against his shoulder, small and warm and trusting, and Valerius, who hadn't wept since his own father's funeral, felt something break open in his chest. Dawn broke blood red on the morning of the eclipse ceremony. Mirelle was braiding Lysara's hair when the guards came, weaving silver thread through blonde that would catch the moonlight during the ritual. The princess hummed softly, a melody in the ancient tongue that made the air shimmer with contentment. The door exploded inward. 6 guards in council livery flooded the room, led by Duke Moros himself. He held a warrant scroll, its wax seal still smoking from the magic that bound it. "Mirelle of no house," he announced with ceremonial coldness, "you are under arrest for heresy against the realm, corruption of royal blood, and practice of forbidden arts." Mirelle stood, placing herself between the guards and Lysara. "The king has been overruled by council decree." Moros's smile was sharp as glass. "Take her." 2 guards seized Mirelle's arms. She didn't resist. Couldn't, not without making this worse, but her eyes found Lysara's, trying to convey reassurance, trying to say without words that everything would be fine. Lysara's face went white, then red. Her mouth opened in a scream that had no sound, but the windows cracked anyway, spider-webbing outward from where she stood. "Princess, be calm," Moros said, his tone patronizing. "The criminal will be dealt with properly." The floor beneath him buckled. Lysara rose into the air, lifted by magic that poured from her like a dam breaking. Her eyes blazed gold, then white, then something beyond color. Pure power with nowhere to go. The objects in the room didn't just levitate, they exploded. The bed frames splintered. Books tore themselves apart, pages whirling in a vortex. The chandelier ripped free from the ceiling and shattered against the wall. "Lysara, Nivesh!" Mirelle shouted, struggling against the guards. "Solareth Nivesh!" But Lysara couldn't hear her, couldn't hear anything over the roar of her own magic spiraling out of control. The tower shuddered. Stone groaned. Somewhere below, people were screaming. The guards dragged Mirelle toward the door as chunks of ceiling began to rain down. She twisted, desperate, seeing Lysara suspended in the center of a maelstrom of her own power. Tears streaming down her face, her mouth forming words in the ancient language that resonated in the bones of the castle itself. The foundation shook. Walls cracked. The entire North Tower tilted 3 degrees before settling with a sound like the earth breaking. Valerius appeared in the doorway, taking in the destruction, the guards holding Mirelle, his daughter hovering in mid-air, surrounded by shrapnel and magic and terror. Moros stood beside him, untouched, triumphant. "You see, this is what happens when you let the old ways return. She'll destroy everything." Valerius looked at Lysara, at his daughter, powerful beyond measure and completely alone in her fear, and then at Mirelle, the only person who could reach her, the only person who'd ever tried. His hand moved to his sword. Valerius's sword sang as it left its sheath, the blade stopping a hair's breadth from Moros's throat. "Release her," he said, voice colder than the grave. "Now." The guards dropped Mirelle's arms like she'd caught fire. Moros stepped back, eyes wide with calculation rather than fear. "You're making a mistake. The only mistake I made was listening to you for 8 years." Valerius lowered the blade, but kept it drawn. "We're going to the ceremony, all of us." The eclipse hall was packed with nobility, their ceremonial whites stark against the darkening sky, visible through the glass dome. The blood moon had already begun, a sliver of red creeping across silver as the sun's shadow fell. Lysara stood on the dais, small and rigid in her white gown, surrounded by council priests who chanted the modern rite. Harsh, grating words that made her flinch with each syllable. She was supposed to repeat them, to pledge herself to the council's vision of order and control. Her mouth stayed closed. Valerius strode down the center aisle, Mirelle at his side, his sword still bare. The crowd parted like water. The priests fell silent as he climbed the dais and lifted Lysara into his arms, carrying her away from them. "The princess will perform the proper rite," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "The first rite, as our ancestors intended." The council erupted in protest. Moros shouted about heresy, about law, about the end of civilization. Valerius ignored them all. He set Lysara down gently, then stepped back, making space for Mirelle. Mirelle knelt before the princess, taking her small hands. "Mazara Livesh," she whispered, "your people are listening. Show them who you are." Lysara's eyes met hers, terrified, but trusting. Mirelle began the anthem, her voice rising in syllables that predated language itself, sounds that resonated in blood and bone. Lysara joined her, tentative at first, then stronger. The magic came like a storm. Light poured from Lysara's body, not gold now, but prismatic, every color and none refracting through the eclipse itself. The dome above them blazed. The shadows of the First Dynasty materialized in the air. Spectral figures in ancient armor who stood in ranks behind the princess, their hands on phantom weapons. The anthem built, Lysara's voice growing until it filled the entire hall, echoing off stone that remembered when these words were law. The floor beneath them began to glow with script, the original covenant, written by the first vampire king, promising power to those who honored the old ways. Objects throughout the hall rose into the air, crowns lifted from noble heads, swords flew from sheaths. Every ceremonial artifact forged in the First Era answered Lysara's call, orbiting her like planets around a sun. The ancestors' shadows knelt. The council members stumbled backward, their faces white with terror, or perhaps with understanding that they'd spent centuries suppressing a power they could never match. Lysara's final note shattered every glass surface in the hall, and in the ringing silence that followed, she spoke clearly for all to hear. "Telmara Veshtaran, Masara Nivesh. I am the voice of night. My people are at peace." The morning after the eclipse, Valerius held court in the ruins of the ceremony hall, glass still glittering across marble like fallen stars. He'd ordered it left untouched, a reminder of what power looked like when it stopped apologizing for itself. Duke Moros stood in the center of the wreckage, flanked by guards who were no longer his to command. The other council members watched from the gallery, silent as graves. "You had a choice," Valerius said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Adapt or leave. You chose to arrest the woman who saved my daughter. You chose to call her power a disease." He leaned forward on his throne. "You chose wrong. The council will never accept. The council is dissolved." Valerius gestured, and guards presented a scroll sealed with the royal mark. "Effective immediately, a new council will be formed, one that includes scholars of the first tongue, archivists, mages who remember what we were before we became afraid of ourselves." Moros's face purpled. "You cannot. I am king. I can. You have until sunset to leave the realm. If you're still here by moonrise, you'll leave in pieces." The former duke was dragged from the hall, his protests echoing until the doors slammed shut. Valerius stood, descending from the dais to where Mirelle waited with Lysara. The princess held the maid's hand tightly, her other hand signing rapidly. "He's not sending you away." No, Valerius said, and knelt so he was eye level with his daughter. He spoke slowly, carefully, in the ancient tongue he'd spent every night this week practicing. Never. She stays. Always. Lysara's smile could have lit the darkened hall. Valerius rose, addressing the assembled nobility. From this day forward, the ancient language is restored as the official court tongue. All nobles will study it. All ceremonies will be conducted in it. Our children will learn it before they learn to walk. He paused, letting the words settle. We are the descendants of the first dynasty. It's time we remembered how to speak like it. He turned to Mirelle, who still looked like she expected to wake up in the dungeon. Mirelle of House. He hesitated. No house, Your Majesty, she whispered. House Nocthar, he corrected. As of now, you'll take the title of High Advisor and Chief Archivist. You'll oversee the restoration of the sealed libraries, the training of new scholars and, his voice softened, the education of my daughter. Mirelle's eyes filled with tears. Lysara threw her arms around the woman who'd given her a voice, and Mirelle held her back, both of them laughing through tears. Valerius watched them, his daughter and the maid who'd shattered his world to save it, and felt something he hadn't felt in 8 years. Hope. Not the fragile kind that breaks at the first sign of trouble, but the ancient kind, forged in old magic and older love, the kind that builds kingdoms, the kind that lasts.